understanding and reducing sleep problems in children with rare syndromes. Really, that's the focus of what I'm going to be speaking to first. And by way of introduction, I just wanted to kind of let you know really that the work that we've been doing at the University of Birmingham on sleep problems really is contextualised within a broader suite and programme of research that I lead with 3 colleagues in a group called the Cerebra Network. So we're a group of psychologists and researchers that really want to do research that improves the lives of children who have severe or complex needs and their families. And I guess what we mean by that is children and families where there is often dual diagnosis. So these might be children with an intellectual disability and a rare genetic syndrome, or a rare genetic syndrome and autism diagnosis. And we're particularly interested in improving research in these groups because, in general, health, education, psychological research tends to exclude children with these groups of diagnoses. And so, although they might have some of the more pronounced and profound needs, we often know the least about the profile and mechanisms that underpin some of the challenges faced by children and families. And so, as part of the Cerebra Network, we work in partnership with a large number of rare genetic syndrome foundations, including the Smith-Magenis Syndrome Foundation, and really work with families to determine A, what we should be doing research on, and then B, how to do that research. And so because of that kind of collaboration with families, we've ended up doing a lot of sleep research because families have told us that good quality sleep for their child and for them as a whole family is a key determinant of quality of life. Just to prevent you from feeling like you need to take lots of notes today, I just wanted to highlight a few sources that you can go to after this talk if there's anything that I've spoken about that you want to follow up on. The first is researchgate.net. So this is a website that hosts pre-publication versions of all academic papers. So all of the work I talked to you about that's published in academic journals, if you are in a clinical service, an educational service, or within a family context where you can't access that those journals and you actually want to look at the original scientific paper or the data, you can get to them via researchgate.net without having to go through paywalls. A second resource I really would commend to you is the Find website that we've co-developed with families. And this is a website where we're seeking to give to parents and professionals really evidence-based information about a selection of rare genetic conditions across a number of key domains. And so there's information there about behaviours, about sleep, about mental health, about communication, across a number of different syndromes. And I think most helpfully, that includes an awful lot of information from families directly via videos, which are really accessible and informative. For professionals, there's also a section of that website that gives you free access to a number of standardised measures of psychological phenomena that are free to download and use. And finally, as I mentioned, Cerebra have funded an awful lot of our sleep research that I'm going to talk to today. And we have, with Cerebra, co-developed a number of guides, which are really aimed at parents, but also professionals around key areas that families have told us are important. And I guess the aim here is to put back into your hands information to help you advocate for your child, to help you ensure that they're receiving the best possible services, but also how to help maybe assess and support needs like sleep needs, or, and we'll come to this in my talk, things like undiagnosed pain or painful health conditions. Okay, that's the preamble. Let's get down to the kind of core content. So I wanted to just start off by saying a little bit about what sleep is. Because I think there can be a common misconception that sleep is a sort of period of inactivity, because I guess to the world, when we're asleep, we look like nothing is happening, compared to when during wake, where we show lots of different types of behaviour. But actually, sleep is a period of extensive and important activity. Most pronounced would be the neuronal or brain-based activity that happens during sleep. So this first picture here up on the top left is something called a hypnogram. This is an image of different stages of sleep, which you may well have heard of, And these different sleep stages are characterized by differential neuronal activity. So, for example, we know that in deeper stages of sleep, so here stages 2, 3, 4, we see characteristic patterns of slow wave activity across the brain and synchrony in activity across the brain. Whereas in periods of REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, we see a lot more muscle activity, we see a lot of eye activity, and we see states of dreaming. What we know about sleep is that for a typical adult, across the course of a night, everyone goes through these predictable stages of sleep a number of times over the course of the night. And they will always have periods of waking. So you see at the top of this hypnogram, there are moments where there is a return to a brief waking state. And that is normal and typical sleep. But very often it is those brief periods of waking that can lead to challenges and problems in sleep when children or adults can struggle to resettle themselves and sort of restart their next sleep cycle. Sleep is a biopsychosocial process. So there are a number of different biological elements that determine when we fall asleep and how we sleep. And two of those are characterized in this graph at the very bottom. And they're called simply process S and process C. So process S is best thought of as like the internal or homeostatic sort of drive to go to sleep. Put simply, the longer you are awake, the greater you experience a sort of pressure to sleep, and the more likely it is that you will fall asleep. So over the course of a day when you haven't been asleep, process S increases, that drive to fall asleep increases. And then as soon as you get sleep, process S decreases, so you have a reduced drive to fall asleep. But that's combined with a second biological process, which is governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a part of the brain that determines when a certain hormone is released. And that hormone, which many of you will be familiar with, is called melatonin. And melatonin works on a circadian, so a 24-hour rhythm in our bodies. It's secreted, and it is a naturally secreted hormone that helps us to feel sleepy. And so again, in most typically developing children and adults, over the course of 24 hours, we have periods in which our melatonin secretion and synthesis is higher, and that makes us feel more sleepy, and then periods when it's lower. And typically what we get is a rise in our melatonin synthesis and that coincides with, in sort of late evening, a rise in process S. And so the two come together and they help us to fall asleep and maintain sleep until melatonin drops away overnight and that pressure to sleep drops away and we wake up feeling really refreshed and ready for the day. I say that with a huge pinch of salt because I suspect that there's many here today who don't have that day-to-day experience. Sleep is something that changes predictably over the lifespan. So these are some really old data, not from our group, which just show that there is a change in the hypnogram, a change in that sleep staging over lifetime, such that children tend to have more fragmented sleep. And as they enter into young adulthood, their sleep typically becomes more staged like an adult's, but they also experience something called a sleep phase shift. So children and young people as they enter into adolescence are genuinely more tired in the mornings and they genuinely biologically find it harder to fall asleep earlier in the evening, and so they're more likely to stay up late. As we enter older adulthood, our sleep becomes more fragmented again. We experience less slow wave sleep. So there are developmental changes in sleep, and development is an important component of sleep. And then finally, sleep is not something that is detached from the rest of our day, but it turns out sleep is fundamentally important to every single aspect of what we do during the day. So if we want to learn well, if we want to have well-regulated hunger and satiety, if we want ourselves to develop well, if we want to heal well after an injury, all of that is contingent upon the quality and the quantity of sleep that we experience. But we also know that sleep can go wrong in lots of different ways. So this slide shows the International Classification of Sleep Disorders, the different categories of sleep problems that can occur. And sleep problems can have a range of different causes, some of which might be very biologically driven. So maybe something like a sleep breathing disorder, like a sleep apnea. But it can also have psychological and social components, or be more of a behavioural sleep disorder, like insomnia. The thing about sleep disorders is that they do occur across most of childhood. So most, up to about half of typically developing children, will experience some sort of sleep problem at some point in their development. But for most typically developing children, these sleep problems are transient. So they occur, but they also remit, they stop, and good sleep sort of reestablishes itself. Part of the reason we've been doing research on sleep is because that appears not to be the case in children and adults who have rare genetic syndromes associated with intellectual disability. So this very, very busy slide is the result of a very extensive piece of work led by Georgie Agar when she was a Cerebral Sleep PhD student. And what she set out to do was to collate all of the data that currently exist on sleep in people with rare genetic syndromes already published. And she took all of that data together and then she collated it statistically so that she was able to model in a given syndrome how likely is a particular sleep problem and how do these syndromes compare to one another. So across the bottom of this graph, you'll see different syndromes. So here we've got Down syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, Angelman syndrome, Williams syndrome, Rett, Fragile X, etc. And then different types of sleep problems. So sleep-related breathing disorder, insomnia, excessive daytime sleepiness, general sleep problems, sleep-disordered breathing, etc. What she demonstrated in this really important meta-analysis is that sleep problems are much more common in people who have rare genetic syndromes. She also showed an emerging sense that the type of sleep problem is associated with the type of genetic syndrome you have. So etiology seems to matter. The cause of your intellectual disability matters to the types of sleep problems you're most likely to have. But a final problem that Georgie noted, which has sort of focused a lot of our research, is that overall, the quality of the research that was being conducted to describe these sleep problems in rare syndromes was really low. There are a number of reasons why sleep problems might be more common in children with rare genetic syndromes and in children with neurogenetic conditions. I'm not going to be able to go into all of these today, but I would really sort of signpost you towards the sleep guide that we wrote with Cerebra and the sleep cards, which are a sort of summary of these sleep guides. Because that walks you through a load of different pathways that can lead to sleep problems and sort of alludes to why these pathways are more likely or why children with neurodevelopmental conditions might be more vulnerable to experiencing these pathways, which hence might lead to those heightened rates that Georgie identified of sleep problems in neurodevelopmental conditions. But as I mentioned, she highlighted also this really critical problem. So from her work and others, we know that sleep problems are most common in children with neurogenetic syndromes. And this picture here demonstrates what is currently the gold standard for sleep assessment. So if you have a sleep problem, the best way to assess that sleep problem is to bring you into a hospital context, to hook you up to monitoring that will look at neuronal activity, muscle activity, oxygen activity, respiratory changes, all the way through a night. And I think most of you, if you look at that image, will think that's going to be challenging in terms of sensory experiences. That is a child that's been taken out of their normal habitual sleep environment. And actually, for many of the children with neurogenetic conditions, that setup will be intolerable. And so because that, which is often called polysomnography or PSG, is the gold standard for sleep disorder and understanding sleep disorders, we are not often able to apply that in the groups where we need to know the most about sleep. And so instead, what we tend to do is administer lots of questionnaires and interviews. And that effectively means we're going to probably the tiredest group of parents, and we're asking them questions like, when your child woke up for the 7th time last night, did they wake up for 8 minutes or 12 minutes? And then we as researchers wonder why the quality of the data that we're getting is low or doesn't help us to understand mechanisms that underpin sleep problems. And so the question that has focused our research group over the last 8 or so years is, how can we describe and explain sleep problems in children who have more complex needs? And so what I want to do now is just take you on a whistle-stop tour of some of the ways we've tried to do that, to hopefully show you the quality of the data we've been able to obtain. And then most importantly for you, I think, to highlight what that then means in terms of how we understand sleep problems in this particular group of high-risk children in order to assess and intervene in sleep problems more effectively. So I'm going to summarise work that's been led by 3 of our Cerebra sleep PhD students. First, work done by Jane Trickett, now Spiller. Second, work followed up by George Yeagar, and now work that has just been completed by Rory O'Sullivan. And in this sort of set of studies that have been longitudinal, we've been using all sorts of different methods to try and understand sleep mechanisms. Most importantly for us today, we've been using wrist-worn actigraphy watches. So these are wrist-worn devices, a little bit like a Fitbit, that has an accelerometer inside and that can collect really high-quality data on periods of movement and periods of stillness, and from applying an algorithm can infer periods of wake and periods of sleep. And then we've paired that with a number of other different methods, including night vision cameras, proximity trackers, and then a variety of biological measures, cortisol and urinary metabolites of melatonin that I'm not going to touch on today. So our first question was, can we take these wrist-worn devices that are high-grade devices made for research, and can we use them to characterise sleep in children with rare genetic syndromes, particularly in children who may have a number of sensory needs, who would be unlikely to tolerate something like PSG? So just to orient you to this, these are the kinds of data that we get from actigraphy. So on the left, you can see that there are a number of sort of descending lines, and each line represents one day and night. So we think of that as the 24-hour cycle. And then there are black lines going upright. Those indicate activity levels, and they correspond with yellow lines going upright, which are indicative of light levels. Then there are periods of light blue imposed on the data, and that's where the actigraph and the actigram algorithm is inferring that the child is asleep. And you can see here that you get an extended period of sleep, although if you look along the bottom, there are a number of periods of wake even within that sleep. And think back to that first graph I showed you, where we know that there are going to be periods of wake during sleep. So on the left here, this whole actogram is from a 4-year-old child who was typically developing. And Jane, in her PhD, matched a group of children with Smith-Magenis syndrome, a rare genetic syndrome, and a group of children with Angelman syndrome, another rare syndrome, to a typically developing contrast group. And she matched them on the basis of age. And the reason we did that is, if you remember back to my first slide, sleep is developmental. And so your age and stage matters. And we wanted to see whether the actigraphy would show whether these children with SMS and children with Angelman syndrome might have sort of syndrome-specific differences in their sleep compared to typically developing children. And so on the right, in panel B, what we've got is some data from one of the matched children with Smith-Magenis syndrome. And hopefully just by eyeballing the data, you can see that there are significant differences. So this child with Smith-Magenis syndrome actually fell asleep a lot earlier than their typically developing contrast child. They slept for much shorter periods of time. In fact, on some of these nights, probably just for a couple of hours. And during those periods of sleep, there were very high levels of inactivity. So what Jane showed is that we can use actigraphy to characterise sleep in children with complex needs. She also showed that actigraphy captures syndrome-specific sleep profiles. Because one of the things I haven't told you is that Smith-Magenis syndrome is a particularly interesting and important syndrome because we know something about the mechanism that underpins poor sleep in this group. So people with Smith-Magenis syndrome have an altered melatonin rhythm, which means that their melatonin peaks during the day and is at its lowest overnight. And so we tend to expect to see significant wakings overnight, short sleep, and very early morning waking. So that also was demonstrated in this actigraphy study. We were then also interested in, okay, if we can get children to happily wear these watches and they give us higher quality data than simply relying on parental reports, and they take the burden off of parents, can we then use actigraphy to characterize sleep over time? So this is work conducted by Georgie that followed up those cohorts that Jane had first collected data on. And what Georgie was able to show is that not only can actigraphy characterize sleep at a single time point, it can characterize sleep as it changes over time. And one of the really nice things Georgie was able to do was to plot change over time for the Smith-Magenis group in both compared to their typically developing contrast group. So on these graphs, we can see the typically developing data is characterized by the black line, and the grey bars around the black line are sort of where the norms would be expected to fall. And then the coloured lines are each a child with Smith-Magenis syndrome. And she looked at things like total sleep time, TST, and wake after sleep onset, so how much the child woke up overnight. And she was able to show that actually, for a number of children with Smith-Magenis syndrome, although at a group level, it looked like sleep was getting worse, for a number of children, their sleep over time was actually getting better. And that's indicated by the blue lines, where we see that some children with Smith-Magenis syndrome are starting to approach almost the kind of normative black lines of the typically developing contrast group. And certainly we're seeing some decreases in wake after sleep onset, although clearly there are also some other children where over time sleep is erring even further away from the typically developing norm. Okay. Now that we know that actigraphy is a useful tool for us to characterize sleep, we then wanted to take it into studies where we look at mechanism. So if we can characterize sleep, can we now look at why certain children with rare syndromes are more likely to develop sleep problems? And we're sort of tackling a number of these different pathways in a few different research programs. And I'm just going to talk to a couple of the most important today. And the first is physical health problems. So we know from the typically developing literature that if you have a painful health condition, you are more likely to struggle to get off to sleep at the start of the night. But critically, in those periods of wake that everyone has every single night, you're going to find it much more difficult to resettle yourself to sleep. But the gold standard for pain measurement is self-report. So the ways in which we help clinicians and medics to treat our pain is we have to tell them what is currently causing us pain, where it is, what that pain feels like. Is it burning? Is it stabbing? How long it lasts for? For children with rare and complex conditions, that might be much more difficult for them to do. And so we turned in this study to use, again, a more objective measure of painful health conditions and pain. And what we did here was use overnight video footage of children during sleep and at waking. And then we used standardized coding schemes of behavior that typically co-occurs when a child is in pain. And so you'll be able to see in this video a child showing some slightly unusual leg movements, which on a number of pain rating scales would be used to indicate a higher likelihood that that child might be in pain. And so we took this objective way of measuring pain or behaviours indicative of pain, and we collapsed that data onto our now objective measure of sleep, our actigraphy data. And then what Georgie did was she sort of layered every single child's data set on top of each other and aligned, if you imagine statistically, every time a child woke up during a period of sleep. And then she simply asked of the behavioural coding data, if a child wakes up, so that's at 0.0 here, is it statistically more likely that they will or have shown pain-related behaviours in the time preceding their waking and or in the time after their waking? And what she was able to show is that for some children, pain-related behaviours were significantly more likely following a wake after sleep. But critically, for some children, these pain-related behaviours preceded the waking, which might suggest that the reason the child woke and then maybe was struggling to resettle was because of behaviours that indicate the child was in pain. And so I guess my first take-home message is that one of our key jobs as clinicians, as family members, is to always unpick, could a change in my child's sleep, could a change in the sleep of the child that's presenting to me in clinic or at school be related to potentially untreated pain or painful health condition? And this is particularly important in children who might struggle with identifying their own internal states, communicating about their internal states, or labelling their internal states. And for those groups of children, what we need to do is move away from a reliance on them being able to externally tell us about their pain and move towards methods of us looking at their behaviours and identifying that they might be in pain. And to that end, I just want to highlight one particular resource that's been produced by Cerebra, but it's actually a research tool, not generated by us, by actually started by a group in France, called the FLAC Pain Scale. And FLAC stands for Face, Legs, Activity, Cry, and Consolability. And the idea here is that those 5 indicators can form a bit of a constellation that tells us that a child is more likely to be in pain. And the reason we really like the FLAC is because it's been really well validated. So in large-scale studies of children, often typically developing children, their FLAC scores are higher after planned surgery when a child is likely to be in pain. And they also come down, their FLAC scores reduce following an analgesic. And so the FLAC is a widely used clinical tool. It takes about 10 minutes to just watch a child and then score them across these criteria. But it is really discriminative of whether a child might be in pain. This FLAC infographic is freely available on the Cerebra website, and I'd really recommend getting to grips with that and having a go at using it. Okay, a second area that's just what I would love us to consider is that we have kind of well-worked psychological models that tell us that sometimes children's sleep problems, particularly if it's insomnia, can be related to the responses that we as parents give to their waking behaviour. And there are 2 kind of ways this works. So the first is a purely kind of associative model. And this suggests that at the start of a night, oh, I think someone's just accidentally unmuted. Let me just, there we go. At the start of a night, a child often has a whole number of things around them to help them to settle. And very often that might involve a parent. So a parent sitting with, singing to, reading a story to a child, and then the child falls asleep. But remember that hypnogram model, the child's going to wake up multiple times overnight. And when the child wakes and that parent or storybook or whatever it was that was there at the settling period wasn't there when they woke again in the night, they're going to struggle to reinitiate that sleep because they've associated falling asleep with that context. And so they might do a number of different things, and we call these signaling behaviours. So they might call out to a parent, they might run into a parent's room, they might cry. And all of that evokes a very understandable response from a parent, which is to go back to the child. And when they go back to the child can then initiate their sleep. And so these kind of psychological models underpin an awful lot of the interventions that we recommend for insomnia. And very often we're helping parents to think about what are the contexts in which your child falls asleep, and are they going to be present when they wake in the night? And what are you doing when your child calls out or cries out in the night? And is there any change we can affect there that might improve their sleep? And so we sometimes talk about these 2 categories of interventions as sleep hygiene interventions and behavioural sleep interventions. But during Georgie's PhD, we talked a lot about the fact that these models are sort of assumed to be effective, but nobody has ever, as far as we were aware, collected data on whether this is actually what's happening. So are children having parents present at settling? And are those the children that then are recalling in parents overnight in order to help them settle again? And critically, can we find an objective way of collecting that kind of naturalistic data? Because if that is the model that we're basing our interventions on, it stands to reason that then there should be data that support that principle. So Georgie came up with this fantastic idea of using radio frequency identification sensors and encasing them in watches and giving them to parents who are taking part in our sleep studies to wear. Now, you may not have heard of these before, but I guarantee you will have used them. So these are the kinds of things that go on expensive items of equipment, or at the moment, meat, or in fact, olive oil in a supermarket. And they are like an infrared signal that as you walk through the gates out of a supermarket, connect with another infrared device and cause a beep to go off. So they track proximity. And Georgie repurposed these to give them to the children and the parents who took part in our actigraphy studies, and then collected data on how often parents and children were coming together overnight and whether that corresponded with, again, our objective measure of their waking via actigraphy. So just to give you a flavour of the data, this is what we were able to do. So we're able to plot actigraphy data. Here it looks slightly different. So it's the grey bars are periods of waking as defined by the actigraphy. And then we plotted proximity of the child to either their mother or their father. In this study, we only had mother-father dyads who chose to take part. And a green bar means proximity to a mother, and a blue bar would mean proximity to a father. We do have and have run analyses looking at gender differences in response to child waking overnight, but I'm not going to go into that today. Can chat afterwards if you're interested. But what Georgie showed very simply was two really important patterns of behaviour in children with rare genetic syndromes. Firstly, she showed that there were a number of children whose parents were going into them, so there was proximity, even when the child was asleep. So this proximity was not related to the child being awake. And in lots of those instances, we think there are biological reasons why parents are doing this. And it might be related to health conditions. It might be related to being tube fed overnight. It might be related to concerns around epilepsy and seizures. But that parental attention to the child overnight was not causing or leading to a sleep problem. And then the other thing she tested was, if a child has a parent present at settling, are they more likely to have a parent present at waking? So remember, that whole model of why behavioural insomnia might be perpetuated. And what Georgie found categorically in our group of children with SMS and with Angelman syndrome was that association was not present. Now, that's not to say that the psychological models of behavioural insomnia are flawed, but I think what it does tell us is that in these groups of children with rare syndromes, actually, families had incredibly good sleep hygiene. They were doing all of the things that as professionals we might recommend, and yet their child was still waking frequently overnight, and it was unrelated to their parents' behaviour. Okay. Few closing thoughts. Sleep is critical for children with rare genetic syndromes, and for too long, the research literature has lagged behind in these groups compared to our understanding of sleep in typically developing adults. And I think with our Cerebra-funded research, what we've demonstrated is that there are some objective methodologies that we can now apply to describe sleep in these really neglected, clinically high-risk groups, and that those might help us to model causes of sleep problems so that we can intervene more effectively. And secondly, I just want to highlight, particularly for professionals who might be seeing children with rare genetic syndromes in a sleep context, etiology matters. So we know there are distinct profiles of sleep problems associated with specific syndromes. We need to understand those and almost shuffle the deck. So use our understanding of the phenotypes associated with given syndromes to work out which areas we should target first or assess first in order to improve sleep. But I think we also need to be really mindful of the fact that internal causes, so things like pain, and I've not touched on other areas like anxiety, but those are really important as well. Those should be primary targets for us, rather than necessarily jumping straight to external patterns of learned behaviour, for example. So big thank you. Sorry, I've gone slightly over, Leanne, to all of our team at Birmingham who've led all of this research, to our funders, but most importantly, to the families and children that have taken part in these studies with us. And I'm going to hand over now to Leanne, who's going to pick up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that, Caroline. That was, as always, totally fascinating. Recently, Caroline came up to an event we were holding in Derbyshire and presented something very, very similar around sleep to the Smith Magenis community. And I always learn something new every single time I see one of Caroline's presentations. So let me share my screen. Where are we? Here we go. And I'll get started. So firstly, I just want to say thank you for attending today. And my apologies that the previous one was cancelled. I ended up in hospital with a really bad ear infection. So it was my fault in that we were unable to hold it last time. So thanks for your patience and coming along to watch it this time. The other thing I wanted to say is that I've known Caroline now for well over a decade, and we've taken part in pretty much all of those sleep studies that she presented in her previous presentation. So my child's data is in there, and I've lived that journey myself. And I'll start off by introducing myself. So I'm Leanne. I am mum to 3 children. Lily, in between myself and my husband, there is my first child. And then I also went on to have 2 young boys, William and Teddy. I should mention that in relation to kind of how I've been involved with the Cerebra Network, I actually work for the SMS Foundation, and I have been working with the foundation as a comms manager since 2020. Prior to that, I was a trustee to the foundation, and I think I joined something like 2012, and I was able to bring my skill set to the foundation as a web designer and a web developer, and I was able to build the website and help publish information and get that up and running. So that was kind of my contribution, if you like, and how I got involved with the foundation. And then lastly, I wanted to sort of say that this presentation I'm sharing today with you is really around my personal experience and journey as a parent, rather than in relation to my job with regards to, sharing information through the foundation. I wanted to make it clear that this is actually my experience, and some of the information I'll be sharing with you guys as to how we mitigated Lily's sleep problems relates to my own personal experience. So firstly, I want to introduce you to my daughter, Lily. She was my first child, born in 2007, and she will be 18 in January. So we've had many, many years of experience and very disrupted night's sleep. I should say that when she was born, she was a happy and placid baby. She was an absolute cherub, and a complete delight. And one of the sort of what I didn't think was remarkable at the time, but I've learned differently since, is that she never cried. She was a baby that was very, very rarely cried. So while all of my friends in my NCT group had children screaming, she was quite happily laying there placid as anything. And I just thought, oh, we're blessed. We started to notice a few issues early on, and those included things like she had very severe reflux, had a hard time trying to convince a doctor about her reflux. Eventually we were prescribed some special formula for her, but it was pretty horrific. I mean, she was slightly below weight percentile, but that was a big challenge for me. And she also failed multiple hearing tests at the time. Again, nothing particularly unusual, just little things that, small issues that we didn't really trigger any alarm bells at the time. As days turned into weeks, we noticed that Lily's sleep patterns at night were pretty poor, but again, nothing you wouldn't expect from a newborn baby. I mean, you're very lucky and blessed if you have a child that sleeps through the night immediately. But what I did notice, and what was different, was that when I would put Lily down to sleep at night, she would literally lie in her cot with her eyes wide open. She never closed her eyes immediately as she was put down, even in a dark room. And she just laid there awake. She didn't cry or do anything. And I found that quite odd. Again, it didn't really, you know, she wasn't in any distress, so it didn't ring any strong alarm bells. But on the contrary to that, during the daytime, she would sleep excessively, very, very long naps. And, you know, when I was talking to other mums in my group, you know, they said, oh, look, she's asleep now, so she doesn't, you know, she doesn't have a problem with sleep. Gradually, as time went on, some of the delays got more obvious. So whilst all my friends' babies started to crawl, Lily didn't ever crawl. She did manage to get about by rolling, but she never crawled. And she was very delayed with walking as well. So again, she had very poor muscle strength in her legs, very low muscle tone. So there were clearly issues, you know, surrounding walking, and she wasn't developing any speech whatsoever. So again, with my friends' babies, they were babbling and, you know, starting first words. Lily didn't. And then we also noticed that she had recurrent ear infections, glue ear, and that we put down to initially actually as having failed hearing tests, down to perhaps glue ear. And she was a very congested baby. So around the age of 12 to 18 months, we visited doctors, we'd been referred into a paediatrician. She was actually at that point kind of diagnosed with global developmental delay. Oops. So again, as time went on and the gaps actually started to widen, and during those years, early years, she did suffer from a variety of sort of health issues, some of them fairly minor, the ear infections and chest infections, some of them slightly more serious. She developed pneumonia while we were on holiday in Italy. The delays to her gross and fine motor skills were getting more and more pronounced and obvious, and kind of setting her apart from her kind of peer groups. There was clearly a very big delay in her speech. She wasn't talking. We were recommended to start Magenis, which I think we started at around 18 months. And she picked that up remarkably well. She did so well with that. I think she knew about 400 signs before she went to school, and she could out-sign everybody around her. I think the picture there of her is one of her signing. And we also started to notice some atypical behaviours. So some of those included things like hand flapping, which often got sort of misinterpreted as signing, but we could see that she did it a lot when she was clearly anxious in a situation. She would test surfaces out with her head, so sort of mild head banging I put here. And then we started to notice a few tantrums creeping in. I mentioned before that she was a placid and easy baby, and she still was, but we started to get these tantrums that had no real sort of trigger to them. She would just go off, and it could be very simple things like somebody singing happy birthday. So it was an unusual triggers for tantrums. And of course, she still had this very disrupted sleep pattern. And by the age of about 18 months, you would be expecting your child to start to sleep a bit better through the night. Lily wasn't. She could still be up many times through the night. So around the age of 3.5, she was we received a diagnosis of Smith-Magenis syndrome. And obviously, we had absolutely no clue whatsoever as to what that was. In fact, I'd never really heard of the term syndrome other than Down syndrome. So it was kind of really was kind of new terminology to us as parents. And I should say also, I mean, this diagnosis came in 2010. And at the time, there were very big gaps in information. There wasn't really a website as such. There was something basic that existed, but it was sort of developed in the 1990s. So you can imagine it was not particularly useful or helpful. Her pediatrician had never heard of it. Most doctors that we encountered had not heard of it either. So there wasn't a huge amount of information, but what we did get was a Wikipedia handout that had a list of characteristics and symptoms. And from that, you know, the first two on the list were behavioural challenges and sleep. And we were able to pretty much tick off every single characteristic against Lily on that list. So it was fairly clear that she, this was a syndrome that she had. It was, as you can imagine, anyone that gets a sort of life-changing diagnosis like that, pretty devastating. But what it did give us was referrals, it gave us links, it gave us connections to other families. And one of the very first things that we did was actually go up to, literally within a few months, there was a conference happening, so we were able to go and learn about the syndrome at the conference. So what is Smith-Magenis syndrome? So I've often found myself over the years describing Smith-Magenis syndrome as a sort of cross, if you like, between Down syndrome and autism, because it's what most people recognize. And when you've never heard of a rare disease like SMS, it's a useful way of being able to explain it. So like genetic conditions like Down syndrome, you can expect somebody with SMS to usually have some sort of learning disability, but that can range from mild to profound. But the two main characteristics that kind of, I would say, set it apart is this kind of explosive, impulsive and unpredictable behaviours and other behaviours that challenge. And then this disrupted sleep pattern, which is really quite unique to SMS. And Caroline went through some of the characteristics of SMS sleep in her previous presentation. And other things like, you would expect there to be delays to speech and motor skills and a range of other health issues. So, what is the issue with SMS and sleep? I like to use this quote because it's absolutely true. This is from a fellow trustee from the foundation, Nick, who's also a parent to a child with Smith-Magenis syndrome. And he sort of quoted that children with and adults with SMS do not have a problem with sleep. They can literally sleep anytime and anywhere. And if you know somebody that has Smith-Magenis syndrome, you'll know that they will fall asleep in their dinner, they'll fall asleep in the bath, they will fall asleep standing up. It is the parents and carers around them that have a problem with their sleep. And that's absolutely true. So the first point I'd like to make is that this is not a behavioural issue. This is a physiological problem. And as Caroline pointed out in her presentation, it relates to the secretion of melatonin in individuals with SMS. And so what we know is that generally people with SMS typically have this inverted circadian rhythm, a flipped body clock. So the graph on the right here shows, in the red line shows a person with Smith-Magenis syndrome and their melatonin levels. And as you can see, in the middle of the night, their melatonin levels are dropping. Whereas with a typical person, you would expect those melatonin levels to be rising during the afternoon into the evening, into night, and then falling when they wake up. So the kind of sleep disturbances you might expect for somebody with Smith-Magenis syndrome is difficulty falling asleep and staying awake. To be honest, we never really struggled, or our daughter never really struggled with falling asleep, but staying awake was another thing. Excessive daytime sleepiness, which we've noted from an early age, and then frequent nighttime awakenings. So how did this impact our family, and where did it place us? So Lily awoke frequently through the night, every night. And that was a consistency that we knew, even having, regardless of what time Lily went to bed at night. I mean, we went to a wedding once and she didn't go to bed till 2. She was still up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Her sleep was erratic, so every single night was different. We never really knew what time she would wake up. There was zero consistency. When she was little, and actually before we got Lily's diagnosis, we did attempt to transition her to a bed as a toddler. That had been disastrous, and we quickly had to put the sides back up on that cot to keep her contained at night. And we also could not leave her alone. So either my husband or myself or both of us would end up all night with her. And so we sort of sought some professional advice from a paediatrician. Their first thing, with zero understanding about the syndrome, was to prescribe some chloral hydrate, which we didn't really want to knock her out, so we didn't use it. But what I will say is that during this period, we were both utterly exhausted and desperate for some help. So we were actually then referred into a community learning disability nurse who was brilliant actually and really helped with lots of areas, including sleep. And the first thing she recommended was a strict sleep hygiene routine. And many of you probably have seen sort of advice around sleep hygiene. So it's kind of, I mean, really, many of these things I would say are fairly common sense for parents with small children, but no iPads, gadgets or TV before bed, so no blue light. To be instead focusing on a calm bedtime story each night. Lily loved a bedtime story and she got quite animated with those. We would provide her with a warm bath and warm milk before bed. We did try and used, with some level of success, some aromatherapy essential oils, and that proved to be quite helpful. And we were consistent with our timings, so we were made sure that we were putting Lily to bed at regular times and everything, clockwork routine. And then we removed any stimulating toys or gadgets from her room that might be causing her to wake up through the night to play with or stimulating her before she went to sleep. And we ensured, some other advice was to ensure that she had an adequate level of daytime exposure to light. And actually we were given a light box by a sleep team to use during the day, which was, pretty helpful during the dark winter months. And we had to ensure that there was nothing in reach of her cot. And as you can see by the picture here, her cot was situated next to a changing station. I'd left a tub of pseudo cream out that night. So we woke up to pseudo cream everywhere the next day. So the plot thickened and, we'd had to put the sides back up to a cot, but she then learned how to escape from her cot. And at this point, we realized that no one was safe. We had a toddler, a young child running around freely around the house. What we did know was sleep hygiene was brilliant at settling her off to sleep at night. We had no trouble with getting her to sleep, but what we couldn't control was Lily waking up through the middle of the night. And at that time, another baby was on the way and I was heavily pregnant. So we, I desperately needed my sleep. So we needed practical solutions and quickly. So we had to kind of think on our feet and adapt our situation. So Lily had discovered freedom and she escaped every night. So that's SMS 1, parent 0. Our reaction to that was to adapt her cot. And so we built this kind of wooden frame around the top, which kind of prevented her from climbing out. SMS 0, parents 1. Well, so we thought, until one night she found a foothold and climbed out again. So we were back to square one, SMS 1, parent 0. So our reaction was, we'll make that frame higher. SMS 0, parents 1. Lily accepted that challenge and she adapted her escape route. SMS 1, parent 0. So we lined the frame to eliminate any footholds. So we were back to square one again with this enormous frame that we built up on top of her cot. SMS 0, parents 1 for the time being. We realised this was a temporary fix, and it was something that we could rely on for a little bit of time. But I was heavily pregnant, and I could no longer get her in and out of the cot. It was like having to winch her in with a crane. So we looked to social services to help us and support us with that. They helpfully advised us to put her back to bed every time she got up in the night. So that was useful because we'd never thought of that. They refused to fund a specialist bed or any room adaptations, but they did agree to install a gate on her bedroom door. So at least she wasn't able to roam the house at night. So it was time for us to really kind of set about doing our own research. And we did do that. And we decided that our preferred solution was to have some sort of enclosed bed. This was back in 2011. So there weren't a huge number of options on the market at the time, but there were a few companies that had enclosed beds for children with special needs. What we discovered was that options were expensive. We were looking at £3,000 plus, and that we were going to need some help with funding. So we negotiated on prices. We dropped any unnecessary extras, and we helped to design a cot that would meet her needs. We were very lucky in that we had some amazing local charities and organisations that helped with funding and also with the coordination of the paperwork. And actually at the time, the SMS Foundation were able to provide a small grant that went towards the cost of it. And Lily's grandparents contributed also financially to it. And eventually, this wonderful bed that we've designed came. I ensured that this bed had clear doors so that, I didn't want something that would look like a prison for our daughter. So with this new bed and our new kind of routine, we sort of had to set about setting some new ground rules. So we ensured that when she went to bed, she was put into her cot, we settled her in there, and we only ever closed the doors after she had fallen asleep. We never wanted Lily to feel trapped in that bed. We continued with our sleep hygiene routine because that was working. We knew we could get Lily off to sleep at night. And we installed blackout blinds, which were kind of outside shutters, the sort of things that you might see in sort of Mediterranean and in sunnier climates, to help with the kind of early light in the mornings, particularly through summer months. She still woke us up when she was awake. So that usually involved one of us going in and co-sleeping with her. But we were working towards setting a sort of routine and some boundaries as she was developing. So she was starting to kind of understand boundaries. One of those being that she, before 5 a.m. she needed to be asleep. So this was a reasonably adequate solution for us for a few years. And then we noticed things going bump in the night, strange happenings going on. One morning we came into the kitchen and somebody had used our toaster to make themselves some toast. Another morning we got up to find that the iron had mysteriously turned itself on and burned a hole through the ironing board. We woke up to a room that was full of smoke. Another day there was a bottle of drink that was been placed on a shelf that was very high up, had somehow magically gravitated to the floor. And then another day we found that someone had found a hacksaw in my husband's toolbox and used it to cut her desk. So was this a ghost in our house? Or maybe Lily had just found another escape route? So desperate measures for us. Our priority then turned to health and safety, making sure that we were all safe, including Lily herself. So our bedtime routine was good. As we knew, we had no problems getting her off to sleep, and that it was staying asleep that was a problem. She was now getting up multiple times through the night. We were up caring for her during that time. And she had, now with this newfound freedom, she was able to roam the house again. So we had to take a bit of a holistic problem-solving approach to this. Which required multiple solutions that were both practical and visual clues for Lily. So here are some of the things that we used as parents as a sort of multi-pronged approach to bedtime routines, mitigating the sleep problems that we had. We purchased it's called a timer safe. I think they're actually used for cookies, but it's got a timer on the top, so it's kind of visual for her to see. It kind of counts down the minutes, hours, and doesn't open until a specific time. Now, if I remember rightly, we were setting the time on that thing to about sort of between 5 and 6 a.m. And in it, we would put her iPad, and there was just about enough room for a small snack and a drink. We were careful with things like medicines to make sure that they were not accessible to Lily. So we had a lockable medicine cabinet mounted inside a cabinet. And then in terms of rooms and access, we had to be really mindful of where Lily could and couldn't go. So the rooms that could be locked, so for example, conservatory and places like that, were locked. And then rooms that had doors that weren't lockable, we lived in a very open plan bungalow. We purchased some of these little door alarms, window alarms, and they proved to be really useful. She hated the sound of an alarm and wouldn't open the door because she knew it would set the alarm off. They proved very useful for holidays too. I can recommend them. You can buy them on Amazon and eBay and places like that, and they cost about £1 each, so they're not expensive. We also resorted back to using a baby monitor in Lily's room. It just enabled us to know when she was awake at night. But what we didn't want to do is have our sleep too affected. So it was just useful to plug in and have on when she, so that we knew when she was awake. We usually switched it off straight away once she did wake up, because she was quite noisy. And that proved to be useful for a while. And then we also bought a grow clock to indicate to Lily and to help train her to sleep, and so she could understand, you know, at what time she could get up, which was 5 o'clock in the morning for us, and when it was nighttime and that she needed to be asleep. So other things that we did to mitigate sleep was we had to make sure that there were child locks on wardrobe doors and drawers. She had a habit of pulling everything out. And if you know a child or an adult with SMS, you'll know that chaos follows. You know, many times we got up to a trashed room. So we needed to make sure that those were locked. And then not only that, but she'd been using the drawers as steps to climb up on the wardrobe. So it was making the room safe for her. We had to make sure that no valuables were left out, or there was no access to keys, particularly to the house and the car. And that there was nothing potentially dangerous left out. For example, scissors, maybe an iron, you know, those kinds of things. We were keen to keep up with the scheduled daily naps. They had they were very helpful. We had that written into Lily's EHCP. It was important that she kept that. That had no impact whatsoever on her sleep at night. But what it did do was help with the behaviours during the day. We tried to ensure she had adequate light exposure during the day. We kept up with aromatherapy. By this point, you know, we're in teenage years now. The use of electric aromatherapy diffusers has become a thing, and really, really helpful for that. And another thing that we found helpful over the years was the use of white noise, or sometimes called pink and brown noise, or even just a simple having a fan in a room can really help with settling during sleep. That was useful. We did try a weighted blanket for Lily. I actually spent hours making one myself, but she actually turned out not to be very keen on that. So that one was dropped fairly quickly. And we had our own kind of lockdown routine every night. So we, you know, before we went to bed, we had to make sure that doors were locked and that things were removed. So it was a kind of fairly strict sleep hygiene routine for Lily and a lockdown routine for us. And then we kept a regular review of her health and medications, as Caroline would say in her previous presentation, that health can be quite an indicator for poor sleep. And as Lily suffered with these chronic ear infections and chesty coughs and various things over the years, that could often have a big impact on her sleep. We also used a melatonin and acebutolol combination of meds for Lily over the years, which did prove quite useful. The acebutolol is a beta blocker, so during the day it kind of blocked that rise of melatonin pathway, and obviously at night the melatonin was helping for her to sleep. We never found that melatonin actually increased the longevity of Lily's sleep, but what we found is that it did actually help give her a more restful night's sleep. She only ever had a small dose. It was 2 milligrams every night, but it was just enough to take that edge off of her sleep disturbances. And then the other thing, and again, as Caroline mentioned in her presentation, it was one of the biggest things that we found had a very positive impact on Lily's sleep was managing her anxiety. She would get up in the middle of the night regularly as she got older to ask what the next day's activities were, whether she was swimming or going to visit grandparents. So it's clear to me at the time that she was struggling with her anxiety. So one of the things that we did through Lily's psychiatrist was take medications to support and help with her anxiety, and that dramatically helped us. So is it a case of happily ever after? Well, you know, Lily's sleep's never going to really change realistically. But as she has matured, her sleep has improved to some degree. She still wakes through the night. That's a pretty certain thing, but she is very good at understanding the rules now and the boundaries. She knows she's not allowed to play before 5 a.m. and most of the time she will self-manage, and often she will put herself back to bed. So life for us as parents has improved. The quality of our sleep has improved. However, she is a cause and effect child. She loves to wake us up. She gets huge enjoyment out of that, and she will slam and bang doors deliberately to wake us. She sleeps a lot through the day still. It has, as I said before, no impact on her quality or longevity of sleep at night, but it definitely helps with mood and behaviours during the day. And I would thoroughly recommend having naps during the day if you can do that. And we can certainly say, hand on heart, tiredness has over the years had a very, very huge impact on her behaviour. And it certainly leads to increased meltdowns and self-harm. So if you can mitigate that during the day, you go a long way to helping with those things. Despite the fact that this is a presentation from my own personal perspective, I thought this was a useful video that I wanted to share. It's just a couple of minutes. It's something that some film students from Napier University developed as an intern project with us. But I think it's a great way of highlighting the issues with sleep and staying safe at night.
Some bears don't like to hibernate. They think it's not for them. Instead, they get up when it's late and leave their cozy den. Before long, they're wide awake and making a great big mess. For all our sakes, it's not too late to go and have some rest. So we need to make their cozy space as safe can be. A little bear should stay in bed. I'm sure that you'll agree.
So that kind of pretty much concludes our journey and our experience with sleep. I'm just posting a few. I hope some of you might have noticed some of my film references in the titles of my slides. Here are my outtakes. And here are a few photographs of Lily over the years, falling asleep anywhere and everywhere. It really is almost like we often refer to them as sleep attacks. And many a time has Lily fallen asleep in a strange and funny situation. So I just wanted to share those with you. And I want to say thank you for coming and thank you for listening to my presentation. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Leeann. I know you said you learn a lot from our research, but I think I definitely learn more every single time I hear you talk. And I think just such an incredible exemplification of all of the amazing skills and strategies every parent we work with already has at their disposal. And we learn so much about, I guess, the kinds of things that can work and the ways in which we might think about rolling those out for other families as well. So